Nestled along the rugged coast of Alaska's Kenai Peninsula lies Portlock, a decaying ghost town swallowed by the dense wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. But back in the early 20th century, Portlock was a bustling salmon cannery community. It was a place of hard work and amazing scenery until a terror descended upon the town in the 1930s. This area became a hunting ground for a predator that wasn't a bear or a wolf. The nightmare began with whispered rumors of giant, unidentifiable footsteps found deep in the snow and mud of the surrounding logging trails. And the rumors began escalating. Local loggers and hunters would head into the mountains only to vanish without a trace. When search parties would go out, they would find things that didn't make sense. Equipment smashed to pieces, and eventually the bodies of missing men began washing ashore and turning up in the woods, mutilated, dismembered, and bearing the marks of something that had unimaginable strength. This wasn't human. The culprit, according to the native legends, was Nantanuck, a towering half-man, half-beast creature resembling a very aggressive Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The Nantiinaq was a vicious territorial creature that was enraged by the town's presence. And as the sightings of this massive dark figure stalking the tree line grew more frequent, a dread began suffocating the community. The townspeople were under siege. By 1950, the psychological toll and the mounting body count became too much to bear. The entire town of Portlock would be entirely abandoned. It wasn't a slow abandonment like that usually happens with economic decline. It was a mass exodus fueled by fear. Families packed up only what they could carry, boarded boats, and fled to nearby villages, leaving their homes, their cannery, and their entire lives to rot in the Alaskan soil. The post office would close its doors, and Portlock was surrendered back to nature. Skeptics argue that the abandonment was simply due to poor salmon rungs and a changing economy. But those who were there tell a very different story. So what actually happened in the shadows of the Kenai Mountains? Was Portlock the victim of industrial decline? Or does the Nantiinaq still stalk the ruins of the town it violently reclaimed? Let's get spooky. Hey, spooky people, it's your best friend, Kenny. Portlock is the quintessential Alaskan ghost town. If you were to boat there right now, you would find little more than a collection of dilapidated wooden structures, rusting cannery machinery, and the overgrown remnants of a one-room schoolhouse. But it's not the ruins that make Portlock famous. It's how and why Portlock was abandoned. In the early decades of the 20th century, the hardworking fishermen, loggers, and cannery workers of Portlock realized they were not alone in the woods. They were being hunted by a massive, bloodthirsty, half-man, half-beast known to the indigenous population as Nantiinaq. According to the lore, the creature spent years terrorizing the town, crushing the skulls of loggers, tearing the limbs off sheep herders, and stalking villagers through the fog. The story taps into our fear of the dark and our fear of the wilderness. Portlock sits in a unique geographic area. The creation of the industrial town would begin with the global maritime fur trade. The area was first documented by European explorers when Captain Nathaniel Portlock of the British Royal Navy found sanctuary there in 1786. When they anchored in the southern Kenai Bay in the summer of 1786, Portlock recognized the bay's incredible value as a deep, calm sanctuary protected from the violent storms of the Gulf of Alaska. By the late 19th century, the maritime fur trade had completely collapsed. Decades of unregulated hunting by Russian, British, and American traders had driven the sea otter to the brink of extinction. The signing of the International Fur Seal Treaty in 1911 marked the official end of the large-scale fur hunting era. But the Alaskan economy quickly pivoted to a resource that seemed infinite: Pacific salmon. The waters that made the area great for fur traders made it paradise for commercial fishing. Around 1900, an American firm moved into the bay, bringing a fleet of fishing boats and constructing a salmon cannery to exploit the healthy, predictable runs of salmon. And this caused the growth of a permanent community. The town continued to expand, and in 1928, a dedicated salmon cannery was built in Portlock. And this facility was a game changer. The cannery would employ native people from various villages along the outer coast. Early visitors and historical accounts describe Portlock as a quaint, tidy little town. Wooden cabins clustered around the head of Port Chatham, completely isolated from the rest of the world save for the ocean. For a time, Portlock was a functioning bustling, remote piece of the Alaskan economic machine. But Portlock was never a booming metropolis. It was an area that was entirely dependent on a single industry and a single method of transportation. Historical records for Portlock show a community that was constantly teetering on the edge of collapse. The population of the town peaked at roughly 58 residents in 1931. By the time of the U.S. Census in February 1940, the population had already suffered a massive decline, dropping to nearly 31 residents. A community of just 31 people relying on a single cannery connected to the outside world only by a once-a-month service boat had no resilience for any sort of economic downturn. Any disruption would immediately be fatal to the town's existence. The psychological reality of its residents was dominated by the vast, unforgiving wilderness that surrounded their tiny cabins. The dense coastal forests of the Kenai Peninsula are imposing. They're perpetually shrouded in a heavy fog, battered by severe coastal storms, and home to massive apex predators like the Alaskan brown bear. In this environment of extreme isolation, in native oral traditions and the intense psychological strain of frontier life merged to create the legend of the Nantiinaq. The term Nantiinaq is native, commonly translated to mean half man, half beast, or simply a giant hairy thing. We're not simply just talking about Bigfoot or Sasquatch here. The Nantiinaq are not necessarily separate species of animal. They're entities that possess distinct supernatural abilities and are tied to the spiritual health of the land. Some native elders have described the Nantiinaq as a tragic figure, a being that actually used to be fully human. The lore is that these individuals suffered a severe psychic or spiritual break, abandoning human society to live permanently in the wild. Over time, these outcasts became wild men. They grew exceptionally large, developed thick coats of hair to survive the winter, and lost their human language, communicating instead through high-pitched whistles. The creature is associated with the fog. Villagers are told to never venture into the forest or go up into the mountains to hunt when the coastal fog rolled in. The Nantiinaq was believed to be most active and most dangerous under the cover of thick, disorienting fog. The creature is also said to possess an overwhelming foul odor, and its mere presence was often announced by inexplicable feelings of paranoia or sudden strange illness. When you consider the extreme isolation of Portlock, the Nantiinaq makes sense. In a community with a few dozen people where the wilderness represents both the source of livelihood and the ultimate threat to survival, the line between myth and reality easily blurs. The Nantiinaq was a manifestation of the inherent dangers of the Alaskan wilderness. However, as the tragedies and fatal incidents began piling up, the Nantiinaq transitioned from just being a cautionary tale into a convenient scapegoat for real-world horrors. The story that Portlock was hunted and eventually completely depopulated by a bloodthirsty cryptid comes from a timeline of events. Over the decades, these stories were traded among cannery workers, fishermen, and locals around campfires and on boat decks, mutating with each retelling into a terrifying mythology of a town under siege. The earliest recorded instance of the mass panic in Port Chatham dates back to 1905, long before the town reached its peak population. According to logbooks from that era, the native Alaskan cannery workers abruptly evacuated the camp in the middle of the season. The cannery supervisor was clearly frustrated by the sudden loss of his labor force, and he hastily scribbled a logbook entry noting that the workers fled in absolute fear due to a disturbance or something in the woods. The workers refused to return to the cannery for the remainder of the season, forcing the facility to temporarily shutter its operations. Whatever this threat was never documented in the logbook, but the modern lore retroactively says that this mass exodus was an early wave of Nantiinaq harassment. The records show that the workers did return to the cannery in the following year in 1906, which means that whatever threat had driven them away had temporarily subsided. The cornerstone of the Portlock monster legend is the gruesome, highly publicized death of a logger named Andrew Camlock in 1931. Camlock ventured into the dense forest and never returned. When a search party finally located his body in the timber, the scene was horrific. Camlock was dead from a massive, fatal blow to the back of the head. Nearby was a massive piece of heavy log-moving equipment covered in blood, which was suspected to be the murder weapon. The investigation recorded the death as a tragic logging incident. Now, this was before OSHA. So fatal accidents involving snapping cables, falling branches, and heavy machinery were common in the Alaskan logging industry. But the villagers disagreed with the official ruling. The piece of equipment that supposedly struck Camlock was exceptionally heavy. Locals insisted that the machinery was far too big to have swung back on its own and entirely too heavy for any normal human being to lift and swing as a weapon. As the story would be retold, the details grew more and more severe. Regardless of the facts, the difference between the official explanation of a routine accident and the physical brutality of the scene cemented the town's belief that a giant supernatural force was stalking the woods. From 1931 onward, the paranoia in Portlock would grow. Following Camlock's death, the floodgates opened. Throughout the 1930s and into the 40s, a string of disappearances were credited to the Nantanuck. Around the same time as the Camlock incident, an elder named Simeon Kvasnikov from the nearby village of Port Graham recalled the story of a local gold miner. The prospector headed up to his claim in the high hills near Port Chatham for a day of work and vanished completely. Despite organized searches by the locals, no trace of the man, his tools, or his camp was ever discovered. The terror would escalate during the World War II era. A school teacher stationed in Port Chatham during the 1940s later reported a pervasive sense of dread among the cannery workers. She recalled that multiple men who ventured into the high alpine ridges to hunt Dall sheep and brown bear never returned. Search parties scoured the mountains but found nothing. Eventually, dark rumors began to circulate through the cannery bunkhouses that a mutilated body had washed down the mountain during a heavy rainstorm, sweeping into the coastal lagoon right near the town. According to the whispers, the remains were torn and dismembered with a ferocity that local hunters believed could not have been done by an Alaskan brown bear. Residents claimed to find evidence of the Nantiinaq on the trails. In one famous account, a group of hunters tracking a moose through the brush made a discovery. As they followed the moose's trail, they realized another set of tracks was pursuing the exact same animal. These new tracks were bipedal, deep, man-like, and a staggering 18 inches in length. The hunters followed the dual trails until they reached a clearing where the grass had been heavily matted down and torn up. Beyond the clearing, the moose tracks stopped entirely. Only the massive 18-inch footprints continued, heading upward to the fog of the peaks of the Kenai Mountains, suggesting that the creature had killed the massive moose and then carried it away. And if you know how big moose are, sightings of the Nantanuck were rare, but they happened. A local resident named Tom Larson was out chopping wood on the beach to build fish traps when he spotted a massive hair-covered creature standing near the edge of the tree line. He was terrified, so he dropped his tools and sprinted back into the cabin to get his rifle. And when he returned to the beach, he found the creature still standing there, staring directly at him in an unnerving and human-like way. Larson would later claim that he felt paralyzed by his sense of dread. Despite having his rifle with him, he found that he was unable to pull the trigger. After a long standoff, Larson lowered his rifle and the creature casually went back into the dark forest. Even after Portlock was officially abandoned in the mid-20th century, the stories didn't stop. In fact, the empty, rotting town seemed to attract the phenomenon, with travelers and hunters reporting terrifying encounters inside the ruins. In 1968, a hunter tracking mountain goats in the high cliffs above the bay claimed he was aggressively stalked and chased back to his boat by a shrieking creature. 5 years later, in 1973, 3 bow hunters were forced to take shelter from a violent storm in the remnants of the village. They claimed that for 3 nights, heavy bipedal footsteps circled their tent in the mud. It was pacing and making low guttural growls that sounded threatening. As soon as the weather broke, the terrified men packed their gear and fled. Regardless of whether you think of these accounts might have been exaggerated, it shows that there is a deep generational fear in this area. For decades, the story of Portlock remained a localized piece of Kenai Peninsula folklore, traded by fishermen and hunters. However, the legend achieved global infamy following a 2009 interview that was published in the Homer Tribune. Journalist Naomi Kluta interviewed Melanie Helen Keel, the oldest resident in the nearby village of Nantanuck. Speaking in her traditional native language, with her cousin Sally Ash as a translator, Keel recounted the dramatic abandonment of her hometown. According to Keel, when she was just a baby, her parents and the rest of the village were pushed to their absolute psychological breaking point. Keel claimed that the Nantanuck had terrorized villagers over a long period of time. Keel would state that the terror culminated in a sudden mass exodus. She also claimed that her own godfather had been killed by the creature, struck in the head by a winch on a boat in a display of superhuman strength. This dramatic first-hand account by a respected native elder was a validation for cryptozoologists, monster hunters, and paranormal enthusiasts across the internet. An entire town driven into the sea by an unstoppable supernatural predator. However, years later, as the story was spinning wildly out of control on the internet on television, the cousin who had translated Keel's interview stepped forward to correct the record and debunk the Killer Bigfoot narrative. Ash revealed that Melania Keel had largely fabricated the stories of mass panic and monster murders out of sheer frustration. Melania kind of made up a story because she was tired of people asking if this story is true. She made up this story about how Bigfoot was killing people. It wasn't true. Everybody knows that. She would confirm that the natives believed in the existence of the Nantanuck, but she denied that it was a bloodthirsty killer. The natives' relationship with the creature was one of mutual avoidance and respect, not one of a slasher movie. The translator would also clarify the boring reality of why the villagers left Portlock. They moved because of the economy, schools, and the church. So if it wasn't the Nantanuck, then what killed the town? Well, simply boring economics. The Kenai Peninsula didn't have any useful road networks. Transportation of goods, people, and equipment relied on shipping. And Portlock's population of just 31 people made it incredibly fragile. The cannery operated on razor-thin margins, and the community lacked basic civil amenities. There were no deep water ports that were capable of handling the massive cargo ships that emerged after World War II, meaning all cargo had to be transferred via small boats. The one-room schoolhouse was failing. Enrollment was dropping, and modern healthcare was virtually non-existent. The town was living on borrowed time. The death knell for Portlock was the rumble of bulldozers to the north. In the late 1940s, the Alaska Road Commission began infrastructure projects to connect isolated peninsula communities to the modern metropolis of Anchorage. The biggest of these projects was the Sterling Highway. The highway would be completed in 1950. The completion of the Sterling Highway made Portlock economically obsolete. Commercial traffic, tourists, and freight diverted away from the ocean routes and onto the new road system. Portlock, which was without a road connection, was bypassed completely. The cannery operations in Portlock became unstable. Without the cannery, there were no jobs. Without jobs, there was absolutely no way to sustain the village. So the abandonment of Portlock was a gradual relocation over several years in the 1940s. Families packed up their belongings and moved to nearby towns because these communities offered better schools, economic opportunities. By 1949, almost all the families had departed. The only resident that remained was the town's postmaster. He lived in the quiet, emptying town for one final year, tending to a post office that no longer had anyone to serve. In 1950, he officially shuttered the United States Post Office and left, which was the formal death of Portlock. And when you go through police reports and historical archives, there are no official records of mass disappearances or unsolved murders in Portlock during the 1940s. The only officially recorded fatality in the surrounding woods was Andrew Camlock's 1931 logging incident. The dozens of missing hunters and mutilated bodies are not in any sort of historical documentation, proving that the massacre narrative is a complete fabrication. But despite all of this evidence proving that Portlock died of economic starvation rather than a massive monster, the allure of the Killer Bigfoot myth was too much for modern media companies to ignore. In December 2021, the streaming platform Discovery Plus premiered an 8-episode reality television series titled Alaskan Killer Bigfoot. The show capitalized on the debunked mythology, aggressively marketing the presidents that a murderous Bigfoot-like creature sent residents fleeing from Portlock 70 years prior. Alaskan Killer Bigfoot was met with a lot of criticism. Critics would condemn the show for treating fabricated myths as historical fact and completely ignoring the well-documented economic and infrastructural reasons for the town's abandonment. Turning Portlock's history into reality television is a depressing modern cultural phenomenon. The fact that we prefer sensational, violent entertainment over the nuanced realities of rural history is unfortunately sad. The nuance and complexities of the indigenous folklore of the Nantanuck was changed into a generic bloodthirsty monster designed solely for cable television ratings. When you look at the whole story, the abandonment of Portlock, Alaska is a fascinating intersection of geography, economics, human psychology, and indigenous folklore. And the historical record is irrefutable. Portlock was a fragile, isolated cannery town whose entire existence was based on a single natural resource. When the post-World War II infrastructure boom brought the highway to the Kenai Peninsula, Portlock was bypassed by a new road system, and died. Its residents didn't flee in the middle of the night from a blood-soaked massacre. They engaged in the normal migration to get better wages, better education, and better community services. But despite the facts, the legend of the Nantiinaq continues. Why? The human mind loves great stories, and we prefer monsters to math. The slow, depressing reality of a hometown dying due to shifting supply chains is a tragic but boring occurrence. A monster provides a dramatic story. The folklore surrounding Portlock is a psychological coping mechanism, a way to project the grief of losing a community because of modernization onto the vast, intimidating Alaskan wilderness. Today, Portlock stands as a harsh reminder that a town can be erased from the map just as easily by modernization as it can by a bloodthirsty monster in the woods. Please subscribe to this channel, The Spooky Lawyer. Please like and share this video. If you'd like to support this channel, you could become a member of this channel. I appreciate you considering that. You can also support me by liking, sharing, hyping, and commenting on my videos. And I do appreciate you watching my videos. And please stay spooky.